Boris Johnson, a narcissist to the end. Boris Johnson has resigned, and I've explained the behaviour of this greater narcissist in the way that he's lashed out. But the Times' writers all have their various observations to make about him. Do they see what he is? Do they recognise his behaviours and understand what is going on? Do what they describe in terms of his behaviour give us more insight as to what Boris Johnson is? On hearing the death of the Turkish ambassador, the arch-cynic Talleyrand remarked, "I wonder what he meant by that." Johnson is less complicated. There will undoubtedly be a plan. It would undoubtedly concern some advantage to himself, absolutely, showing his calculated nature. And the simultaneous resignation of the woman with one of the safest Conservative seats in Britain, Nadine Dorries, will be linked in the minds of all but the least cynical or suspicious of us. Johnson is looking for a safer seat than Uxbridge, where he is in danger of having to fight a by-election quite soon. One suspects that something more Machiavellian must be in this devious and dishonest man's mind. Indeed, that's an apt description of Boris Johnson. There are some unknowns here. The Conservative Party, for which read Rishi Sunak, would have to decide whether to sanction a chicken run by Boris from one constituency to another. I am by no means clear that this would be a foregone conclusion. Would he risk it? If not, the alternative explanation may be that he simply wants to be out of politics and cannot bear the thought of fighting an Uxbridge by-election. This way, he would at least leave with his head held high. We shall see. The one fixed point in any commentary is that Johnson only ever acts in his own self-interest. And therefore, that is interesting to see how that is identified, of course. That's all that matters. And it is all that matters to Boris Johnson. There are two things you need to understand to make head or tail of Boris Johnson's extraordinary resignation statement. And it was extraordinary because there has never been an analogous event in 300 years of having prime ministers. The first thing to understand is that there are many Tories who still believe Johnson is popular, was badly wronged, and can one day return. This, of course, is something that Boris Johnson wants to engender in that belief to ensure that he has the relevant support. These people believe that Johnson himself is part of the future of the right and not just its past. They believe that restoration of the true king and reassertion of the true faith will require a political revolution, and they are willing to attempt to bring one about. And one of the people who thinks all this is Boris Johnson. The other thing to understand is that most Tory MPs realise that Johnson is no longer popular. They think it's all over for him and appreciate that, however potent he may have once been. These days are behind him. And one of the people who thinks all this is also Boris Johnson. If Johnson didn't think he still had a political future, he wouldn't have bothered with his statement. That, of course, is the self-belief that he has. The rage bit might just be a loss of control, but the political agenda stuff was very deliberate. Indeed it was. Yet if he didn't accept he was no longer popular, he wouldn't have stood down. He would have let himself be recalled and fought the by-election. Well, in actual fact, he, thinking ahead, sees that he will have problems with regard to fighting a by-election. And, as his status as a greater narcissist, he sees to head that off at the past, that he wants to ensure that he doesn't face further problems, and therefore he defeats them before they come along. The writer asks, surely he can't think two completely contradictory, incompatible things. He most certainly can, and of course, that is the mindset of the greater narcissist, that he will tell a lie and knows it's a lie, but has no problem in stating it. That he can think of two contradictory things because that suits his purposes to get to the prime aims. As both of these sentiments, the optimism and the pessimism, are temporarily useful to him, and there the writer picks up on the very essence of what the greater narcissist does, the recognition of what is temporarily useful, he will think both of them, even though they are inconsistent. That's how he rose. Farewell, Boris Johnson. It's been interesting. The decision of the Prime Minister to step down as a Member of Parliament ends one of the most consequential British political careers in the post-war period. He turned the country upside down, leading a revolt against the established system, taking control of the Conservative Party and removing the UK from the European Union. And now it's over. Naturally, the egocentric Johnson doesn't see it that way. His resignation after being told that the authorities were going to impose a punishment for him misleading the Commons over lockdown parties, telling lies, is merely a temporary setback, he insisted. It has ended his Westminster career only for now, he said in a furious statement. He will return in triumph in some way, he implied. All day speculation had swirled over the controversial honours list Johnson demanded. Who would be on it? Who among his cronies would resign as an MP, causing a by-election if the Whitehall machine refused to accede to his suggestions? At no point was it imagined that Johnson himself would resign so suddenly, having been told on Friday that the judgment of the Commons authorities met the criterion for a petition to force a re-election. In the evening, he announced that he was going. The implication in his resignation statement is that he will stand as a candidate in a subsequent by-election. This presupposes the party will allow him to stand as an official Conservative there or in any other constituency after this week's farce. That looks unlikely, especially now after Johnson's resignation and his attack on Rishi Sunak for betraying him, he claims, his own legacy. For Boris, it is, as always about Boris. There is no humility. Once again, now that he has been caught, it is everyone else's fault. This demonstrates, of course, the grandiosity and blame-shifting of the narcissist. The Commons has conspired against him, the former Tory leader claims. Paranoia. After everything that has happened, the spectacle of Johnson complaining about an absence of fairness and propriety is the final irony and takes a proverbial biscuit. He is an absolute shower. The guy has run his entire career on the basis that rules and codes of behaviour don't apply to him. And as we know, because of his narcissism, they don't apply to him in his mindset. A bitter, raging Boris Johnson is blaming everybody else for his failure and disgrace. He's lying to the end. The Privileged Committee is not a kangaroo court, but a Tory majority committee with only 2 Labour members. The Tories were not, as he claims, just a handful of points behind Labour when he left office. They were 15 points behind in August 2022, compared with 19 now. Revision of history. And let's remember that it's not other people but Johnson's own greed, insecurity and misjudgment that have systematically sabotaged his career. Forget Partygate for the moment. Think back to 2016. Johnson backed Brexit, not because he believed in it, but because he calculated that by doing so he'd get the backing of the Tory right and outflank George Osborne as the next Tory leader. He didn't need to do it. He was already the Tory favourite. If Johnson had stuck to his Europhile views, Brexit would have lost. He'd have succeeded Cameron in 2018 or so, and could be heading for his second term as Tory PM in a far more prosperous Britain than today. Not the divided, anxious, disillusioned, poorer country that's the Johnson legacy. Of course, not that he cares about that. Millions of people's lives have been made meaner, narrower, and more miserable by the selfish, incoherent ambitions of one man. He never expected to win the Brexit vote, had no plans for it, and even when he reached number 10, he never cared to work out what to do with it. It was just a vehicle for the promotion of Johnson, which of course is accurate. He will admit no responsibility for it, of course as a narcissist he never will, or for anything he has done. In Johnson's narcissistic, scheming universe, he sees himself as always the innocent party. Indeed, that is completely correct. He never sees that it's his fault. He always acts with self-interest. And these are just some of the observations that have been put forward by a number of the Times writers, Matthew Parris, Daniel Finkelstein, Ian Martin and Jenny Russell, all of them identifying the character of Boris Johnson as self-seeing, self-serving, calculated, Machiavellian, and above all, that of a narcissist. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.